The other thing that's going on beneath the surface, though, which maybe doesn't get talked about enough, is if you think about why Bitcoin has done so well over the last 18 months, it's been a really simple story where ETFs and corporations have bought something like 5x the new supply.
Yeah.
So there's been more demand than supply. Well, actually, since the start of May, ETFs and corporations have bought 32x the supply of Ethereum because we've had this huge growth in Ethereum ETP flows, right? They did, I think, $5 billion over the last 8 weeks. And we've had this huge growth of corporations buying Ethereum. So the same sort of supply-demand story that drove Bitcoin for the last 18 months, and Ethereum just kind of sat there and went down, is now happening in Ethereum. So there's a vibe dynamic and there's the supply-demand dynamic. And you have to ask yourself, will these vibes continue? Absolutely.
Matt Hougan dives into crypto's big leap into public markets, ETFs, regulation, and what's next. Stay tuned to find out.
Loved making those predictions. I like calling us out for being specific. We like to be able to be measurable on our predictions. We won't get them all right, but I think it's better than being general.
Yeah.
On this one, we really saw two things at work. So on the one hand, we were optimistic on the outlook for crypto. And if you're optimistic on the outlook for crypto, you think the market for companies building in this space is growing and substantial and there to be. The other factor that went into that prediction is that the IPO market was severely repressed by US regulators for the 4 years prior to this election, right? Circle, as an example, which for what it's worth has been the most successful IPO in the US in, I think, 10 years, right? It was 25x oversubscribed. The price has gone up 8-fold. It's been huge. Mm-hmm. It tried to go public for 3 or 4 years, but the SEC wouldn't let it out. And so we saw all of these firms that were substantial in size, whether it's eToro or Circle or Kraken or Chainalysis or some of the others that are in the pipeline, that were sort of just waiting at the door. So once that regulatory environment changed, we thought they would run out. Now, I do think it's primed for this moment we're in because there are a lot of professional investors, institutional investors, financial advisors who want exposure to crypto, but are more comfortable with these companies. And I think that these IPOs and crypto equity ETPs are feeding into that group that want exposure because they know crypto is happening, but maybe their risk departments aren't comfortable with owning Bitcoin, but you can have exposure to Circle, you can have exposure to Coinbase, you can have exposure to some of these pre-IPO companies. So we think this trend is going to accelerate. Stablecoins are sort of a skeuomorphic tool for crypto. There's something that matches our existing understanding of how finance works, but just makes it faster, quicker, better. I find that traditional investors can understand stablecoins faster than they could understand Bitcoin, and certainly faster than they understood something theoretical like blockchain, that you're trying to describe how this technology worked. It's like, no, here are dollars that move at the speed of light and settle instantaneously around the world. And people say, oh, that's cool. So I do think it's really helped with the vibe shift. I think it's made crypto real. Yeah. And it's also brought in Wall Street, which is important because it solidifies the regulatory environment for crypto, right? It's no longer crypto versus Wall Street. It's crypto and Wall Street. And that means that Washington is now pro-crypto on a long-term basis. And that's been the other major vibe shift that I think it's brought on.
Bitcoin is back on the rise, quickly bouncing from a dip that followed a tense Federal Reserve meeting. Just as markets were digesting the Fed's decision to hold interest rates steady, Bitcoin shot up nearly 3%, aiming for a bold new target, $119,000. This sharp turnaround wasn't just market noise. It came as news broke that the U.S. government still plans to launch a strategic Bitcoin reserve. That revelation helped flip the mood instantly. Fed Chair Jerome Powell offered no clarity on future rate cuts, leaving traders uncertain. Yet, as soon as the meeting wrapped, Robert Bohines from the President's Council of Advisors on Digital Assets stepped in with a surprising boost, confirmation that the government's Bitcoin reserve plan is still moving forward. He emphasized the administration's support for the Bitcoin community and promised swift action, calling Bitcoin strategic and reaffirming their long-term commitment. Meanwhile, corporate Bitcoin treasuries didn't wait. In just 48 hours, major institutions snapped up nearly 30,000 BTC despite market turbulence. Charles Edwards of Capriel Investments highlighted that institutional net buying soared to 97% of transactions, a level not seen since August 2020. As excitement over the strategic reserve grows, it's clear that big players are already acting on what they believe is coming next.
Yeah, there's been a real vibe shift on Ethereum, to use your word, Alex. I think it started when the Ethereum Foundation replaced its leadership, which happened earlier this year. There was a recognition that it was moving too slow, that it was too ivory tower and not enough real world. And they started to gain momentum. And then you're right, Tom Lee came on board and packaged it in a great marketing scheme, as he always does. Tom's a good friend of mine. And talked about Ethereum as the stablecoin chain. The other thing that's going on beneath the surface, though, which maybe doesn't get talked about enough, is if you think about why Bitcoin has done so well over the last 18 months, it's been a really simple story where ETFs and corporations have bought something like 5x the new supply.
Yeah.
There's been more demand than supply. Well, actually, since the start of May, ETFs and corporations have bought 32x the supply of Ethereum, because we've had this huge growth in Ethereum ETP flows, right? They did, I think, $5 billion over the last 8 weeks. And we've had this huge growth of corporations buying Ethereum. So the same sort of supply-demand story that drove Bitcoin for the last 18 months, and Ethereum just kind of sat there and went down, is now happening in Ethereum. So there's a vibe dynamic, and there's a supply-demand dynamic. And you have to ask yourself, will these vibes continue? Absolutely. Stablecoins and tokenization are going up and to the right from interest levels. And then will the supply-demand dynamics continue? I think absolutely. Ethereum inflows don't look to me like they're going to reverse. And these ETH treasury companies are trading at something like 2x their NAV, which means there's going to be more of them. So at least from the short term, I think the trends we've seen since the start of April really can persist in ETH, and I'm pretty bullish, and I think it'll get to new all-time. It's so funny you raised that. I got yelled at by the Ethereum community for forecasting it could top 5,000. I got all these angry emails. I was like, guys, it's at 2,500. This is a double in 6 months. That's bullish. What are you talking about?
Not joking, people.
The crypto people. Yeah, 100% in 6 months.
100% in 6 months.
Is bearish. I don't know about 15K. I mean, that's extraordinary. I would love for him to be right. I am more tempered than that. I think we get above new all-time highs. I think it may well outperform Bitcoin through the end of the year, and I'm very bullish on Bitcoin's price. But I don't know that we, what is that, a 4.5x from here? I'm not sure that that's in the cards, but I do think the trends are all in its favor. Supply-demand dynamics, stablecoin and tokenization interest. I think it's a very bullish outlook for Ethereum. Maybe not Tom Lee bullish, but very bullish.
The White House has officially confirmed that the strategic Bitcoin reserve is still very much active, even though it was noticeably absent from the latest digital asset policy report. While the report focused heavily on building out a regulatory framework for cryptocurrencies, it made no mention of the government's ongoing efforts to accumulate Bitcoin. That raised eyebrows, but officials are now making it clear Bitcoin remains central to America's long-term digital asset strategy. Bo Hines, the executive director of the President's Council of Advisors on Digital Assets, spoke out to clarify the situation. He reaffirmed the administration's commitment to accumulating Bitcoin, calling it a unique digital asset that stands in a class of its own. While the report prioritized regulation, Hines assured that strategic accumulation is still happening behind the scenes. He also explained that infrastructure to support Bitcoin reserves is under development, ensuring the reserve's sustainability for years to come. As for how much Bitcoin the U.S. actually holds, Hines remained tight-lipped for security reasons. But independent analysts at Nansen estimate the government's holdings at around 198,000 BTC, currently worth about $2.35 billion. This massive reserve isn't just a headline. It's part of a broader plan initiated by an executive order from President Trump in March to secure the country's position in the evolving digital economy. If you have been watching so far, thank you so much for watching, and do not forget to subscribe to Bitcoinzilla for daily news, all for free. That's all for today's video. Until next time.